very briefly share some of their experiences with financial management or budgeting. Maybe you were kind of an interim CFO or something like that, just to get a feel for some of the experience. Anyone?
So if you raise your hand, I will run the mic to you. Of course, it would be on the other side of the room.
My experience around financial management has just been majorly on managing projects, doing forecasting, using the end value management tools, doing some analysis around project management. That's just where I've been able to utilize the tools of financial management. But managing organizations' finances, I don't have any experience in that regard, and that's one of the reasons I want to really learn financial management.
Great, thank you for that. We have another couple hands.
All right. Yeah.
Hi, yes, my name is Mehak, I'm from Pakistan. So I actually worked 1 year on a USAID project where I was assisting in the reporting side. So basically what my job was to ensure that the whatever expenditures that were incurred during a certain time period, they were recorded in a particular sheet. So we had this one in particular, and just sending that out to our donor agency. So I did a lot of reporting in terms of just the financial reporting for that.
Yeah, reporting is certainly a critical aspect. We'll get one more hand.
Hello, my name is Deepa. I'm from India. I think 3-4 years back, I was heading a youth-run organization in Mauritius. So I did not have a finance person. So basically, I did like from financial planning to income, expense, and everything related to financial planning, management, and implementation. Everything. So paying salaries to myself and the team. Getting money in on time. Everything. I mean, so I have a little idea. So I think I managed a budget of around 3 million Mauritian rupees, which is not so much. We converted into USD, but over there was a lot, and it was a lot of headache. I mean, it seems very easy, but then when you sit down and actually do it, it's a lot of work. Initially, I thought, oh, I would be able to manage it, yeah, but it takes a lot of time and energy. Yes.
Absolutely, thanks. So I know there were a couple more hands. We are somewhat limited on time in this section, so we're just going to move forward. And if there's time at the end, I'd love to hear some more about your experiences because I'm sure it will benefit the larger group. So the overall kind of course objectives of this whole financial management section are tied around kind of 4 core areas. The first of which is developing kind of a basic knowledge of how to work with financial statements. And that's something that will be tackled later on in the week. The next is understanding the importance of budgeting to kind of improve skills and really provide a financial base for any and all organizations. Moving on, it's kind of designing and implementing the larger financial plan of an organization. So bringing in things like the balance sheets, bringing in the budgeting and things like that, with the kind of overall goal of increasing the overall confidence that you can bring to an organization. So as I've mentioned a couple of times, I'm primarily going to be focused on budgeting. Could I get someone who maybe have an idea on why budgeting is important?
Hang on.
It's important in order for you to manage your resources for a given period of time, so say for a particular year or quarter, so that you don't overspend or underspend, actually, because it's a sign of efficiency. So.
Awesome, thanks. And we'll get one more.
As I believe that budgeting is very important for a project or for any proposal, because it is truly said that money makes a mayor go. So for a project, for anything you want to run it, you have to use your resource mobilization. So money is the biggest resource or biggest thing which should be mobilized to run or to activate or to give life to the proposal, because otherwise, but in the meantime, it shouldn't be embezzled or it shouldn't be used in a negative manner. It should be used constructively. A constructive usage of budget is vital for our project. What I just said.
Yeah, the constructive piece is certainly important. So having budgets, sorry, we're running a little low on time. I hate that I can't answer or select anyone to pick on. I apologize up front. So there's really three large kind of components to why budgeting is really important to an organization. The first is how it can really be used as a tool to maximize the resources that an organization has moving forward. If you look at everything that kind of is on the plate up front, you're not going to be spending money on areas that maybe doesn't align 100% with the vision of the organization you're working with. The second is to really identify where issues, financial matters, and things you could run into in the future. So if you realize that there's a huge gap from the amount of money that you need and you're expecting to use for different programs or projects throughout, and you don't have the funding for that, you want to know that up front as opposed to once you've already paid for them. And the last is just providing more of a concrete, bringing your maybe more abstract visions into kind of concrete sections, if that makes any sense. So you can look at a line item on a particular budget and say, this is going to this specific project. This is how much money it takes for this value connected to this specific project moving forward. And sometimes that's helpful when you're kind of talking to potential donors or grants, things like that, really allocating exactly where their money is going. So before we get into more of the details of budgeting, I think it would be helpful to provide you guys just a brief example of what a kind of working financial budget model looks like. And so we've created one in Excel, which breaks apart a couple of different pieces. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes just showing you kind of all the intricacies that are part of budgets. This template is kind of all the formulas and everything associated with it. So if we look at the first tab, and would you mind hitting the plus sign a little bit? You can see how it might be hard to read. Yeah, that works. So for an organization to work, the first components, and it's pretty important, is a staffing plan. There's probably someone somewhere working for every organization out there. And so this kind of first tab of this Excel template, you break up all the different, I guess, people within your organization. And you're really looking at the total FTEs, which is full-time equivalents that are required for each program or project. So for this particular organization, there's 3 programs associated with it. And you see a fundraising, admin, and then shared. So shared is someone split across all the different functions. So just as an example, for program 1, it's going to require 1 vice president and 5 staff, as you see on line 7. So this is just a way to kind of organize so you can address salaries, which is seen in tab 2. So here we type in the particular salaries for each level of positioning and factoring in things like benefits and the raises that they're going to want and things like that. And this will kind of automatically populate the total program costs. If you look at the third tab, this is where you're looking at things that maybe will make more sense in terms of what you think a budget is, all the different particular line items moving forward. So here we see books and publications, consultants, depreciation, things like that, attributed to specific projects moving forward. And there's kind of a running sum at the bottom. So these are kind of the three primary tabs. We have an additional one which compiles all of them together. And then the last one will bring in things like variance. So at the end of the year, how close were you to your budget, so that you can improve upon it for next year, such that you can really have an accurate budget tool to provide guidance to the organization. So I know that was detailed. I just want to show you guys the overall larger possibilities of it. But if we could go back to the PowerPoint now. Thank you. So if you go to the next slide, the financial planning process that I touched on earlier that we're going to be covering over the next few days, at the base of it, you see operational budgets as they kind of provide the activity and operational planning moving forward. So it's important to have the vision and everything that you see at the top of the pyramid, but kind of the graphic is trying to show that without that budgeting standpoint to it, you don't have the base for the vision to really do anything of great magnitude moving forward. So there are, within this pyramid, there's kind of two sections. The first is setting the budget. Once the nonprofit or for any organization has detailed its activity plans in accordance with its strategic vision, it will draw upon its budgets and cash flow projects to implement these plans. This is monitoring and evaluation. So during the year financial reports should be prepared and compared to the budget with the actual financial performance. This step is critical just in ensuring the overall benefit and value that the budget's providing. So there's three kind of larger steps within the budgeting process. The first is associated with planning. So I know there was some pre-work associated with coming up with either with your specific organization or organization you're a part of, some basic kind of brainstorming, looking at what are the parameters that are going to define your budget moving forward. The second step is developing. So you're bringing in those parameters that you identified through research, through past expenses and things like that. And then the final step is refining and finalize. So this is throughout, after you've created it and you've started using it, it's important to go through and make sure that your budget is a valuable tool that is accurate and aligned with what the organization is truly doing. So looking at the first, planning. I don't think people spend enough time in the planning steps. They're excited to look forward and get the ball moving. But planning is essential for budgeting. Kind of the first step within it is defining the project objectives and activity categories that support the project and organizational goals. In doing so, you're going to look into things like cost centers and something called the chart of accounts. This is essentially bringing in all the past performance of your organization and really breaking it down into where the money has been going and where you expect it to go moving forward. So there's a couple of other steps, including policy for costing, research, standard costs, and then a couple more is like looking at quotations if you can't figure out what certain values are. So all these kind of steps are jumbled up, but can be organized into three primary buckets. The first is researching the routine costs. And can I get a show of hands of who here was able to kind of do that with the pre-homework? Not sure if you guys got it. Okay. We'll just add that to the budget making activity later on. We have some time allocated for that. So the first step is you're looking at kind of the historic data and researching market prices for things that you're not sure of, you haven't spent money on in the past, to kind of estimate what those values are moving forward. The next is establishing the budget categories. So you can think of this as the buckets that things are going into. Is it associated with transportation? Is it associated with fundraising? Is it associated with renting an office? Things like that. And then the last step is defining the template and process and really pulling everything together in an organized manner.
What's the difference between the first two, the search of routine costs and the establishment of budget categories? What's the difference?
You can think of the difference as the routine costs are in terms of trying to think of a tangible example. So if you're thinking about having an office, some of the costs associated with having that office are buying pens, buying paper, buying things like that. And so in that first category, you're looking at kind of past experience and saying, I spent X amount of dollars on pens, X amount of dollars on paper. And this next step is consolidating those into the one category entitled office. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Can we say that the research, the routine, the rent of the office, stationery and things, and when you say the budget categories, they could be like, for example, in an organization, a marketing department will have these cost heads, and then, let's say HR will have these cost heads. So under HR, they will go marketing and some other, let's say, departments.
Precisely. There's two buckets or two larger categories that we're looking at. So for larger organizations where you have those HR branches and things, you're exactly right. On the smaller scale, your categories are going to be a little bit smaller and more granular, but you're right on track. Thank you.
Categories mean identify donor-specific budgeting categories. It's in the second one.
So for nonprofit organizations, that's a great question. Is donors sometimes will say for an organization, I only want my money to go towards education, and they'll earmark certain aspects of their donor money to specific categories. And so you need to pull that and make it a point to incorporate into your budget that that's the case, because you can't, if they give a certain amount of money on education, you can't go spend it on medical supplies. So that's what's meant by that. Okay, so in looking at typical cost categories, there are variable and fixed costs. Variable costs are things that fluctuate with the amount that you use them. I'm not sure if you can see it, but I can read a couple of them off. Are examples of different cost categories. Many of them are variable costs, but there's a couple of fixed costs within it. So can someone give me an example of a variable cost or something that will fluctuate that it's used or that you're using it or things like that? An example would be if you're paying for your cell phone bill and you don't have a fixed plan, you're paying I don't know what costs are, maybe $30 per gigabyte. Every gigabyte you spend, you're paying $30. So yes. Into that kind of transportation category. So the more you maybe contract. What's tricky is if you contracted out transition to something along the lines of, we're going to pay this company $500 a month to drive us around no matter how far we're going or how much we're going, then it would turn into more of a fixed cost. And so when you're looking at budgets, fixed costs are easier to work with because they're easier to predict. There's always a little bit of a guessing that goes into variable costs. So whenever possible, try and I guess negotiate your way into more of a fixed cost because there's less risk on the financial state of the organization as a whole. Could someone give me, so we did variable cost. Could someone give me another example of a fixed cost?
Rent. The rent.
Fixed cost, I would say salary.
Okay, so we have salaries and rent. That is correct if the salary is based off kind of a yearly event. If you're paying someone by the hour and they have the opportunity for overtime and things like that, then it can kind of become variable. So you can see kind of the tricks and overlaps associated with budgeting. But thank you. So many of these cost categories are easy to find, but there's a couple that are hidden or you might not think of right off the bat. A couple of these include things like overhead or core, such as utilities or insurance, or even with staffing, benefits. If you're required by a certain country or state that you need to provide your employees benefits, that's going to go above and beyond what you're paying them in salary. So it's something that's very important to consider. You also have equipment renting and maintenance, vehicle running and maintenance, logistics, audit fees. There's a number of hidden costs that can easily be overlooked if you're looking, if you're narrowing your research to maybe something that initially just comes up on, if you're going through your credit card bills or something like that. You need to think a little bit harder. And here are just a couple of examples. Can anyone think of a hidden cost that isn't shown up here? What's that?
Cost of funds, like which you have to pay to the bank or your something like donor or marker.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Also be something, depreciation, is that vehicle running and maintenance or?
Yeah, depreciation is a great example. And it's looking at, so equipment runs down, your car's not going to last forever. And so in the budget template that I showed before, there's even a category for depreciation of certain assets within your organization. But it's something to absolutely keep a mind of if you're looking at liquidating those assets in the Yes.
Well, regarding the hidden cost, when you write a proposal to a donor, so you don't know exactly what cost that might come up, which is this we describe as a hidden cost. And this might affect the budget that you are proposing. And as you said earlier, like donors might say, I need my money to go to education projects only. Then it could be inflation that might affect the proposed budget. So in order to avoid that, like how many percentage should I put over the exact amount to fund a project, a particular project, in order to avoid this hidden cost in the future?
So giving a specific percentage is tough to do because there's so many different variables depending on, I mean, with inflation, every country in the world is different. I'm going to touch on a couple of ways to approach that issue though with budgeting in a couple slides though. So I think that should clear it up. If not, let me know. All right. So yeah, it's after the activity. Okay, so after The next step is to work on developing and kind of consolidating everything into those larger categories, which obviously depend on the size of the organization. So you're developing the high-level activities that support project and organizational objectives. You're identifying the detailed contributing costs, goods and services of each activity. You're estimating the number of units for each good and service. You're applying standardization costs to units, typically dollars. For goods and services with unknown costs, research the market and use evidence-based costing. You're going to look into capturing the hidden costs as best you can. And then you're linking indicators and quantitative targets to activities. And so what that last line means is what is an indication of success for your organization for a particular project. So you can start to gauge how much it costs to hit that particular target moving forward. So I know I've given you guys a whole bunch of information moving forward, and now probably not going to take the whole 45 minutes, but maybe 30 to 40 minutes looking and planning kind of a mock budget. So many of you are part of very much a part of organizations, or even which are smaller and you know much more of the inner workings, and others of you are more familiar with a larger organization where maybe you're never going to kind of touch this stuff. Either way, the point of this activity is to go through and, for an organization you're connected with, go through and do the basic planning and designing of a budget moving forward. So that first step is looking at all the connected activities, costs associated with running that organization, and then looking at kind of identifying how they maybe fit together and organize it onto a budget sheet. So I have in front of you, you should see a printout. I apologize for the printing quality. It's not the greatest. But on the wider sheet, so there's two sides. There's a wider one. The first column that you're looking at is an opportunity to put down the description of a particular line item, followed by the projected cost for that program. So this is coming in from the view that you're an organization with 3 different programs. And so each program will spend a different amount of money on each descriptive line item on the far left. And so the top half of that, the template in front of you, has your income. And so it's broken into, this assumes it's a not-for-profit organization. The first is kind of funding broken into government, donor specific, things like that. And then the lower part is just true expenses. So you're going to fill out the different activities on the far left-hand column, do their associated costs within 3 different maybe mock or fake programs that you think would be relevant to your organization, sum them up on the far right, and you've got yourselves the skeleton of a basic budget moving forward. So before you jump into looking at the specific template, I encourage you just to brainstorm and think within your groups on just coming up with the basic research and understanding for budget examples moving forward. Don't dive straight into the template without first thinking through some of the intricacies of your particular organization. Do you guys have any questions? All right, well, I'm excited to hear some at the end of this session, some of the ways you guys broke up your budgeting procedure. Yes, so the top, yikes, this printing is, so the organizational budget side.
Not organizational overview.
Correct. The overview is going to be used in a future session this week.
Down at the bottom, it says page 1 of 2 on the side that you're working on now. So if you have any questions, raise your hand and we'll come around to help. Is it one group per table? Let them talk and the
How about it's up to your table. If you guys want to do your individual ones, if you have an organization that you think would really benefit from walking through this, you're more than happy to do it by yourselves. If you want to do it as a team, that's also welcome. And feel free to change any of the headers. So if fundraising or administration isn't relevant to you, feel free to cross those out and type in whatever you think. All right, sounds great. Thank you.
like what he was doing, and then for social media managers, then for the website designer, and then for the consultation people who were traveling problems that related to that same topic. You can, for example, for solutions, for and it started from the training trend on that page, the language for example, for people so if it's something like that, you need so you have to earns itself like work. And then there's the governmental people. And then there's the no in here, but it's the government part like yeah. So let's talk about that. So let's talk. We found out about the object. So what comes under government? So let's work on that. Oh my God. Like how much? Okay, so 500, 200. Then the government we need that. Oh, I would make it. Yes, contributions.
All right. Just to clarify, for a couple of people have asked, do not feel as though every box needs to be filled. Many organizations are not having income coming from administration, meaning that no one has earmarked $1 million for administration for this particular organization. It happens, but it's not as common. And I'm happy to continue walking around answering other questions. Just want to give you a heads up. We're going to try and wrap this up in the next 10 minutes to provide some discussion. Obviously, it's nowhere near enough time to have a completed budget, but this is just to give you an idea of what to get started. And you're going to have some more time later in the week to work on this and finish it. So don't feel like you need to finish it right now, but continue to work. So I just had a question about the top part of the income statement. There's 3 categories. The earned, government, and contributed. These are just 3 examples. You can change them if needed. Earned refers to things if you're selling a particular product and receiving revenue from that, it would fall under that category. For government, you would have grants, things like that. And then the last is the contributed. So this is from individuals or NGOs or things like that. Sorry for the confusion.
So just write the name.
Yeah, it's
For example, book yeah. How about the inside? How about the for example, if you would be contact, for example, how the marketing to
Oh, there was.
How about over here?
This is it.
Oh, wow. Oh, what's your So you were doing well, I had seen all the
All right, guys. All right, guys. I'm not sure. All right, can you hear me? Great. So I know it was a very short amount of time, and you'll have more time to work on this later in the week. But there was an interesting question brought up regarding conversion rates. So many of the organizations that you all are working for have outfits or programs outside of this country, and you could perhaps run into issues with certain amounts of funding being provided in the US dollar, but it needs to be spent via the local currency in whichever country that program is operating in. And so my advice for that moving forward is to err on the side of whatever is the less stable currency. So historically showing the US dollar has proven pretty stable. So that will mean that you're going to budget by providing yourself a little bit of a cushion for the currency you're working with. So if you're working with the, someone throw out of a foreign currency.
Today's pounds.
Okay, pesos. We'll do pesos. So if I'm going to butcher whatever conversion rate this is, but say $1 to 5 pesos. So if you were, and there's many pesos out there in the world, so you don't know what I'm talking about, which one I'm talking about. But $1 to 5 pesos. So when you're budgeting and you're calculating how much you're going to spend, you might want to only spend maybe 4 pesos worth compared to that dollar, just so you have a little bit of a cushion moving forward, because you don't want to spend the 5 pesos and then have the conversion rate fluctuate one way or the other, because you could really hurt your organization and put yourself in the black or in debt. All right. I also noticed, looking through the slides, I did skip a slide which addressed your question before, and this is looking at budgeting and allocating indirect costs, many of which fall into that hidden cost category. And so there's 3 primary ways to address indirect costs. There's the direct method, which is typically used for direct costs shared across 2 or more projects or funding sources. You're using partial units to specific expenses to attribute costs to 2 or more projects or donors. So essentially what this means in more simple terms is if you have indirect costs spread across a whole bunch of different projects, you have 4 projects and you have a grouping of indirect costs, you're going to divide that indirect cost by 4 and just give each of those budgets 25% of that. The percentage method is similar to that, where you're only using a fixed percentage instead of, all right, no, I got that mixed up. So what I just described was the percentage method. The direct method is if a certain particular project has an indirect cost for a particular project, facility, things like that, you're going to attribute it directly to that organization. So an example, if you had for project number 1 and some administration cost, you're only going to charge it to that one project, whatever is spent in administration on that one project, in that one project. If you have, say, for example, 1 administrative assistant that's split between 3 different projects, then you would go into the percentage method and divide that administrator's cost by 3 and attribute it to each individual one. The last is more of an unrestricted method, and this is where you secure funding strictly through kind of earmarked donations, where someone says, I'm just going to give you money that only needs to be spent on these sort of indirect costs that can't be directed to a specific project, and is obviously the best and easiest to work for because it provides you the most flexibility. That being said, it's the hardest to come by because more often than not, donors want to see their money going to more value add activities.
Testing.
Opposite to the scenario you just raised. Let's say, for example, let's use Jamaica. Let's say in the last 3 months, Jamaica's dollar has devalued. So it went from 70 to 100 to one US. USAID is then funding a project, and so it's estimated that it might further devalue to 120. So to be safe, you've given yourself a $20 cushion, and you've estimated that everything is going to cost at that exchange rate. At the end of the project, it hasn't gone up, it's now at 100. So you have a lot of money that you didn't spend. What standard USAID procedure is in the back? You return it to the donor, you invest it in a project that's already there. What would be the procedure to have a normal situation?
That's a good question. So just to reiterate, there was a lot of static. So the question is, you provided yourself this buffer with the exchange rates moving forward. And at the end, the rates stayed exactly how they were, or maybe went the other direction. And now you have a whole bunch of money left over at the end. More often than not, this funding comes as more of a use it or lose it scenario, where you have to spend it within a certain amount of time. So my suggestion moving forward, and I think Google would agree with me, in the sense that it's best just to plan for that. So provide yourself maybe a couple of opportunities to spend that extra currency or buffer at the end of the year that maybe as kind of like a bonus project or something that maybe you went into some of the initial planning for, and you have the flexibility to spend the money at kind of the last moment. So I think it really just comes down to planning. So I'm not as familiar with the absolute specifics between USAID, but I can say just from a planning perspective, the more you plan up front for kind of every possible situation moving forward, be it too much money, too little money, the more planning you can do, the better.
Just to answer your question, I have managed a couple of USAID projects, and yes, they do allow for that. They usually require like a project report, financial report. So all you have to do is to give them notice and do a justification as to why is it that you have so much money remaining. And if you can outline an activity in keeping with the original scope of work, then they will allow it. Sometimes it's not just the exchange rate doesn't change. Sometimes you have exchange gain. So they give you a certain amount of money, but because your value, the dollar of your currency devalues, you kind of you get more in the account. But they allow for that, provided that you inform them and it's in keeping with the original scope of work.
Awesome. It's awesome having a great panel of experts to work with and answer my questions.
To answer Al's question, I'm working in the current USAID project with my host organization, and what we do is usually we ask for a no-cost extension, so you can kind of like continue with the project, and but we don't give you extra money. So after you've submitted your final report for the previous project, and if you have a certain amount of money you've not spent, so you do a no-cost extension where you continue with the program without us giving you extra money.
Great, thank you. So this slide was just I've gone over it a couple of times, but after you've made your budget and developed it and everything like that, it's important to refine and finalize, not only directly after you've worked on it, but throughout the remaining year or the period of kind of performance of that particular budget. So don't just look at it at the beginning of the year once you make it, and then at the end, it's kind of a living document, living tool that can be used for the organization to identify financial gaps or problems moving forward. So to build on this, at the end of the year, when you're looking at your budget again, it's important to look into things like budget variance. So budget variance is what it kind of sounds like. You're looking at the variance of what you expected to spend versus what you actually spent. So in a perfect world, all of our budgets will be exactly what we predict them to be, because that means we are maximizing resources to fit with the vision of our organization. So the first step of variance reporting is comparing the budgets with actual expenditures, including significant expense comments. So with expense reports, which we covered later in the week, you're going to compare those year-end financial statements with your initial budget and just compare them, see where maybe there were big gaps, and see if you can provide explanation for those gaps such that moving forward for next year's budget, you will have more insight into making it a more accurate prediction. The second step is fix intervals, i.e. quarterly, and match timelines for budgets and expenditures. So in order to make this reviewing process happen, you're going to need to compare a financial report that meets the exact same timeline as your budget. You can't compare maybe an expense report over 8 or 9 months to a budget that's, for example, over the period of a year. It's possible to do in just dividing up and doing kind of the math, but it makes it significantly more difficult and won't provide as accurate of a picture. The next step is displaying these discrepancies in absolute amounts and percentages, just to give you more visibility moving forward. And then the last step is give explanations for any significant variance. So again, you're looking at these percentage differences, figuring out what can be done differently next year, now that we have more insight into maybe some of the variables that can come into play throughout the year that can impact this, and see if we can better predict in the future. So I know you've gotten a whole bunch of information in the last hour or so in terms of budgeting. And hopefully you were able to walk away with something that you didn't know before. There will be an additional budgeting kind of part 2 section where you're going to have an opportunity to relook at your the budgeting templates that you guys worked on briefly today. But to quickly review today of the overall steps in making the meaningful budget, first is you're looking at reviewing the past performance of your organization. The next is creating realistic objectives. After that, you're looking into estimating kind of some of the future constraints, and in terms of funding, how much money in grants are you going to be getting, things like that. The next, you're looking at future expenses. So your budget's made up into the income and expense. This next part, we're looking at expenses. And then the last section is comparing the revenue and expense predictions. So at the end of the year, or at the end of the quarter, or whatever period of performance of your budget, you're going to look at the variances that we talked about. So we have a quick mini debrief. We have a couple of minutes. We're not going to hit all these questions, but I think it would be beneficial for the group if we could get a couple of volunteers. Does anyone know what the difference is between a fixed and a variable cost, and could provide an example of both of them?
A fixed cost is something you have to pay every month or year. A variable cost is something that differs. Sometimes you have to pay it. It's not consistent.
And an example?
Salaries, for example, or rent, or paying for electricity or utilities or whatever are fixed. And if you're doing like a special project in a certain month, like for example, the GLL is a variable cost for Alice.
So one comment that I would like to bring out in terms of the electricity as a fixed cost, depending on where you're living, that can differ. I just want to clarify for some people who have similar apartments to my own, where you're paying by megawatt. So if you leave the air conditioning on, we're going to be charging more that particular month, and so that would turn into more of a variable cost.
But I mean monthly, if we're talking monthly, it was probably, like, if I might.
What do you think?
No.
These happen every 4 months. So you calculate, you see the annual budget, every 4 months there's going to be a bill, so it's not happening every month.
It's a fixed cost on an annual vision, but it's not, it's a variable cost on a monthly budget.
So just to clarify, so I'm not 100% familiar with the way this organization views this GLL and everything, but just speaking from kind of what I've heard, if they know that to run this session, it's going to cost X amount of dollars, no matter what, there's very little variance with it, it's going to be a fixed cost. Your budget month to month will be variable, because this month might be more expensive than last month because of this, but that doesn't make it a variable cost. What makes it a variable cost is the lack of predictability that comes away from allocating money for it. So if they didn't, it would be a variable cost if for example, they didn't know the number of people that were going to come to this event, and they promised each person lunch, they would have to buy lunch dependent on the number of people who came. So then it would be more of a variable cost. Is budget variance reporting important?
To avoid over or underspending of the project, I can monitor the activities.
Exactly. So the response that he mentioned was looking at you don't want to underspend or overspend, because especially from a not-for-profit perspective, underspending means that you weren't maximizing the amount of resources that you had, and perhaps you could provide more value to your organization's vision moving forward with that money. And obviously, you don't want to go into debt and need money. So the point of the variance is to look at moving forward, how can your organization better predict and reduce the kind of variability and uncertainty surrounding the financial state of the organization. So with that, I think we're somewhat limited on time. I'll be hanging out for a little bit after this if you want to ask me further questions, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you guys so much for your participation. Great group.
We are glad you're tall and didn't brown. That's wonderful. Awesome. Okay, so quite a day we had, but great participation, you guys. And I like Stephen, appreciate the amazing amount of wisdom in this room. All right, we have a couple of quick last announcements before we put